Hello there, welcome. So we're going to talk about Synapse, but actually we're talking about Synapse within Fabric. So one of the points that I've seen over the last couple of weeks is around the differences between the Lakehouse and the warehouse. Now those constructs have been covered elsewhere. Some great videos and blogs out there about the two different ways of loading and working with data. But one of the things that I've seen over the last couple of weeks is some slight confusion over what you can do in the Lakehouse SQL endpoint and what you can do in the warehouse. As essentially the Lakehouse, it's Spark based, whereas the warehouse is running on a SQL engine. So there are some things you can do in the Lakehouse SQL endpoint, and there's some things you can do in the SQL warehouse. However, the SQL warehouse side of things, you can do more in terms of SQL, which is what we're gonna cover here. So I'm going to jump into Fabric and go into a workspace. So I'm just going to pick the data engineering persona and go into a workspace. Now I've created a Lakehouse and I've also created a warehouse. So when you create a Lakehouse, you'll get three items. You'll get the Lakehouse, you'll get the SQL endpoint, and that's what we're concentrating on, and you'll get the data set. Now, as I said, creating these and working with these, has been covered. I'm concentrating on the SQL endpoint. When you create a warehouse, which is a completely separate item that you can create, there we go, new warehouse, yeah, and that's basically the SQL engine side of things. We get a warehouse and also a data set. Yeah, so regardless of whether you create a Lakehouse or a warehouse, you always get this default data set that gets created. So if we have a look at the SQL endpoint first, so we click into the SQL endpoint, notice that I can actually switch between the SQL endpoint and the Lakehouse just using the little context switcher in the top right. Now what I'll do is I'll show you just a Parquet file that I've just loaded into the files section of the warehouse, and I'm going to create a table. So I'm going to do it cheap and cheerful. I'm going to right click the file and click load to tables, and then just call it raw web telemetry, confirm that, and that's basically going to load that raw data from the files area of my Lakehouse, and it's going to create a table. Actually, if we refresh and have a look at how that's getting on. Okay, so now if we refresh and have a look at the tables area, we've got that table that we created. So click on that and I should get a preview of some basic event data up. So what that's done is that's essentially taken that raw data and it's created a table in the Lakehouse underpinned by Delta. Great, fantastic. So we can bring in our data and create tables, and then what I'll do is I'll switch to the SQL endpoint. We can start writing SQL. And that data set as well can be used to build reports because that's connected into the data as well. I'll expand and we'll see that in the tables section, we've got raw web telemetry. So the SQL endpoint is able to read, the schema of that table. Here's where the fun begins. So if we go in, look at the DDL side of things, if we want to create objects within our Lakehouse, we can create some objects in the Lakehouse using the SQL endpoint. What we can't do is work with data. We can't create tables, we can't insert, we can't update or delete. So if I try and create a table, I'm going to get a failure to say you can't do that. So any of the table creation can't be done in SQL. And the same if we want to go and do anything else with a table, like create external or create table as select. Again, we're prohibited from doing that because we can't create tables. We can create store procedures and functions and views. So there we go, a very, very basic store procedure there. Absolutely no problem. And then if I execute that store procedure, there we go, I get a value. So you can do some things in the SQL endpoint. You just can't create tables. When we go into what we can do with existing tables in the SQL endpoint, we're constrained to selecting from the tables. So there we go, I've got a select query, run that select query, and give it a few seconds, cold start, and we'll get some results back to say, there's our data, aggregated by event type and device. Run it again, there we go, comes back pretty quick. If I want to insert anything, so let's have a look. We go in, we're going to run that, and I'm going to get that policy error. Or no, I get the DML statements are not supported error. So can't insert into a table and can't update. And as you've guessed it, I can't delete either. So any manipulation of the data in a Lakehouse table has to be done outside of the SQL endpoint. It's just read-only. I think of it like serverless SQL pools in Synapse. Yeah, you can't modify any data using serverless. Yeah, you can use the create external table, but that's separate. So when we're working with a Lakehouse SQL endpoint, read-only in terms of tables and in terms of data. So if we switch to a warehouse, so let's have a look at the warehouse. So we'll click into the warehouse. I don't have anything pre-existing here, so I've got no tables, no objects, nothing like that. Yes, I can create functions, views, store procedures, etc. Stuff I could do in the SQL endpoint. But now in the warehouse, because it's based on the SQL engine, I can create tables. I can drop tables. I can insert. I can load data and modify the data in that table. So let's have a little look here. We'll create a table. So drop table, if it exists, we'll create that table, and then we should refresh and be able to see that. Give it a few seconds. I was probably a little bit too eager. There we go, web telemetry. Okay, and then all our columns. And then from there, I can run a copy into command, and I'm just specifying the location of that Parquet file. So if I run that, then anyone familiar with copy into, let's say from the the dedicated SQL world, it's the same construct here. Don't have the full feature of copy into, so auto create schema. It's not in there yet. That's something that I'd like to see in there sooner rather than later. But there we go. So we've got some records. I think it's about 1.6 million records loaded from that Parquet file. We don't have any support for truncating a table. I'm going to run this delete command, but we all know that running a delete command on a table, not great, because it's taking, this amount of time to just get rid of all that data in the table. So probably drop the table, recreate it. So just worth calling out there. I can insert and select, and this time what I'm doing is I'm using that Lakehouse table that I created. So I'm using the SQL endpoint to load data into a warehouse. I want to stop for a second and just talk through that, because yes, loading data from a Lakehouse into a warehouse means that you're copying that data. You're making two versions of that data. So you're taking it from the Lakehouse and you're copying it into the warehouse's storage, which is Delta. It's the same as a Lakehouse table storage. Now you can create shortcuts. So in a warehouse, create a shortcut to that data. However, if we're doing any form of transformation, cleaning, anything like that to get it into a warehouse format, dimensions, facts, aggregate tables, etc., you're going to be copying data into the warehouse. So if I run that, then just like the copy into, it's going to take a few seconds to insert the data into that table. There we go, 1.6 million. And then I can just select from that table. And the data set, I can create endpoints. So in fact, I've got that model tab, and I've got that model tab in both the warehouse and a Lakehouse if I want to model Power BI data sets, create measures and so on and so forth. But there we go. I can select data. Now if I try and insert, and of course, I'm doing a singleton insert, which for these sorts of analytical database systems, you don't really want to do. But we just want to test the functionality, right? We just want to see, hey, look, we can insert into this table. I'm not being constrained by anything. There we go, one record affected. So we'll just make sure that that record exists in that table. Let's have a little look. There it is. And then just to prove that we can update data, I'm going to change the event type to put in basket. There we go. Event type put in basket. And the last thing I'll do is I'll just delete from the table and then select rows not there. Yeah. So that's just the first in the series in looking at the Synapse data warehousing side of things. So just to recap, when you create a Lakehouse, you'll get a SQL endpoint, which is a way of writing SQL to read the data. And that's the most important thing to remember. You can only read. You can only read the data. You can't modify any schema information. You can't create any new table objects, nothing. Yes, you can create functions, you can create views, you can create store procedures, but it's all about reading data. On the warehouse side of things, hey, we can create tables, we can load those tables. Yes, we can still create store procedures and functions and views, etc. But now we've got control over the objects that are in, the table objects that are in our warehouse. But something to note is when you load a warehouse, you're loading data into its storage. You're loading it into Delta, which underpins the tables. So when you load from a Lakehouse into a warehouse, you're going to be copying that data. We can create shortcuts. These are the sorts of things we'll cover later on from the warehouse to limit the amount of data that we're moving around and, basically take some benefits of the fact that we can create data once in a Lakehouse, reuse it multiple times. So if this has been useful, please give it a like. Any questions, comment, and if you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.